So in this final chapter, we are looking at environmental economics, equity, and policy. And there are a few aspects of this concept that I want you to study. First of all, on the slides that are posted on Moodle, there is a simpler set of slides. And on the second slide, it will tell you the limited number of pages that need to be read to cover these topics. So the topics that we're mainly going to focus on here are the idea of environmental justice and provide additional case studies in addition to the ones we've already talked about, and look at how those injustices are being addressed. A second thing to consider as you're reading through this is the idea of the precautionary principle. If something seems to pose a harm and not be helpful to the health of humans or the environment, then perhaps we should take action against it to stop it or reduce it. And third, to understand that it is all one earth. So we share the same air and water, for example, and we also have a responsibility toward one another in terms of equity and policy. So let's start here. Whoops. Actually, we'll start here with a case study for this chapter. And in the 1960s, along the border between Mexico and the United States, but in northern Mexico, a variety of assembly plants propped up. I believe the word is pronounced maquiladoras. And the idea was that international companies were allowed to import materials and equipment to northern Mexico tariff-free. And that way the companies were able to find a workforce that could work for fewer dollars. And this was enhanced in 1994 with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. That was an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The intention was to increase trade between the three countries. And what happened was the companies found this to be very profitable because they could be assembled in a country where, again, the wage was lower and the safety for the workers was not as enforced and costly, and the safety for the environment was also not enforced and costly. Mexico welcomed the NAFTA agreement because it meant additional jobs. Unfortunately, what happened to Mexico was that there was increased pollution, poor working conditions, discrimination, and social injustice in that most of the profits went to other countries, not to Mexico. So this became another example of an environmental injustice, and changes to NAFTA and other considerations have been employed to try to address these changes, but so far that really hasn't been very successful. So if you were to use this as an example of environmental justice and to answer the question about what has been done or could be done to rectify the situation, you would have to go with what could be done. So the goal of environmental science, of course, is to live more sustainably. So we'll revisit the definition of sustainability, living on Earth in a way that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I like the graphic here from the textbook. And it's saying that human well-being is one consideration, the environment is another consideration, and economic interest is another consideration. So right now, there's this very small intersection of the three, where all three are met: human well-being, economic interest, and environmental protection. So the goal here is to move these circles closer together so there's more overlap, and this very small area is increased to a much larger area. So let's look specifically as to what is meant by human well-being and environmental protection. So human well-being includes adequate supply of food. That would be both in the number of calories and the quality of the food, so that it included nutrients that are needed, such as vitamins. Social well-being, so that the socioeconomic status of a particular population within a particular country or between countries, is not adversely exposed to environmental harms. The availability of education. In many countries, women can't be educated. In many countries, they do not have higher education. So the more education that is available to a population, the more both of these things happen. More money for the human, more economic interests met, and better treatment of the environment. The availability of jobs is, of course, critical. The status of women is critical, and the consideration of their health and the disease of humans, and whether all the groups have adequate access to health care. In terms of the environment, we have to consider the natural resources, such as anything, trees, oil, etc. Natural services, such as services that are performed by bacteria in the soil that clean the rainwater and runoff before it reaches the aquifer. And we need to consider the intrinsic value of biodiversity. So I'm going to go through this very briefly. How do we work towards sustainability? Well, it takes a combination of understanding economics, input from government policies, non-government organizations, and individual and community action. We're going to skip through some of this for now and take a brief detour here to look at one approach to increasing the wealth and productivity, the increasing human productivity, human protection and environmental protection through a process called micro-lending. So in micro-lending, the idea is that something like the World Bank gives a small loan to an individual to purchase materials, in this example, like a wheelbarrow and farming equipment. And as a result, the person can have increased income, improved quality of life, increased productivity, and they pay back the loan. And in actuality, that actually has worked. The far majority of individuals provided these loans did use them and did pay them back. And so one of the reasons the program like this has been successful is because the people loaning the money put requirements on the person who is accepting the loan. And one of the requirements typically is to have increased education, where they meet maybe once a week with someone who will tell them more about the farming effort that they're doing, more about how to handle their money. And these efforts are typically directed toward women, and they become more educated. This increases their confidence. They become more empowered, and along the lines, they can also have more sound environmental practices. So one of the obvious direct lines is less fuel used to bring food to local markets, more profits for the women, and a lower fertility rate. And in fact, in some cases, the loans are requiring a decrease in the fertility rate from the person borrowing the money. So there are a number of examples of this, and one of the sayings that I think applies here is that if you buy a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he can eat for a lifetime. And that's the goal here, is to provide a way, rather than just putting that money to feed someone, to put that money so that they can feed themselves. Okay, now we focus on environmental justice. First, the definition. It's a social movement that is focused on equal enforcement of environmental laws. So, for example, if an environmental law is in place within the United States, It needs to be equally enforced, whether in a poor neighborhood or a rich neighborhood. And also environmental laws need to be enforced internationally. If there's an environmental threshold that we wish to reach in the United States, it's not acceptable to have a lower threshold for, let's say, Mexico. And the second focus of environmental justice is to eliminate disparities in exposure to environmental harms to different ethnic and socioeconomic groups. So here we have examples from the past, things like the Shell oil refinery and chemical plant that anchored a 4-block neighborhood in Louisiana that was exposed to more environmental harms. We might be talking about, for example, the situation in Bhopal, India, with Union Carbide, an American plant that had a shoddy factory, which ended up poisoning many thousands of people in India. All right, so you can take some time if you have the time to read through the role of government, but basically it comes down to laws, regulations, taxes, which are disincentives, and incentives, like we will give you some money if you lower your miles per gallon of your fleet. Sometimes it involves treaties among nations, and we can't forget that you need to have agencies to actually monitor and enforce these regulations and laws, and hopefully to research and develop new standards. So here are some other ways of achieving sustainability, not just through governments, but non-government agencies. Innovation from companies, maybe coming up with environmentally friendly technologies as opposed to using fossil fuels. Businesses may achieve sustainability. I think I already told you about a company called Lightolier in Massachusetts, that found that they could save their business millions of dollars by changing some of their processes when they built commercial lighting. So that would be an example of how businesses can achieve sustainability, and it might actually benefit them economically. And of course, we can't forget individual and community action. Being aware and educated is huge. And when we can act at home or act at work or vote or just plain old communicate, that's awesome. So skipping ahead here, we need to look at the triple bottom line. And sustainability is believed to be achievable when the intersection of the three circles of mutual concern for all humans, the social, environmental, and economic, come together as closely as possible. So some closing thoughts here. One is to keep in mind the precautionary principle, which was the philosophy that action should be taken against a plausible environmental hazard. So whether that plausible environmental hazard is something like lead or mercury or adding CO2 to the atmosphere, if it's plausible, then it's time to take action. Also, looking to prevent or reduce the amount of an environmental hazard is far better than trying to clean it up afterward. It's cheaper and it's more direct and it's better all along. When we look at some of the methods that we want to use to reduce environmental harms, you have to analyze all the pros and cons, the whole life cycle analysis, because it usually isn't just a straightforward balance between two options. And last, we really need to realize that we are living in a global time economically, and we're living in a global atmosphere environmentally. So we need to realize the interconnectedness of all of these countries. So that's a wrap for chapter 15. Look forward to some information on studying for the final.